Alex Karp is here. He is the co-founder and CEO of Palantir Technologies. The company's data mining software is used by various government agencies in the United States, including the CIA, FBI, and NYPD. I am pleased to have him here at this table for the first time. He does not do many television interviews.
If they are not scared, they don't wake up scared, they don't go to bed scared, they don't fear that the wrath of America will come down on them, they will attack us. They will attack us everywhere. Never forget, it is really important to win.
Apple and other mega caps, Google, Meta, Amazon, they're on the outs in terms of political favor, making way for a new class of Washington-friendly tech companies that are defense first, they're US made, and they're cashing in on a new era of hard power AI.
Yeah, is there any topic he won't opine on?
No.
America's ability to organize violence in a superior way, and then use it in a much more moral way than any other country would, given its ability to do this, is the single reason why the world improved over the last 70, 80 years.
It's the Oppenheimer quote, and I think I was in trouble for saying yes, and he got to criticize building the bomb because he was still alive.
Alexander Cadman Karp is the CEO and co-founder of the data analytics firm Palantir Technologies. Named after the Seeing Stone from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, the company helps Western governments and Fortune 500 companies see hidden patterns in their data. Palantir has a current market cap of almost $450 billion, setting Karp's personal net worth alone at $16 billion. Palantir has grown rapidly in the last 2 years as part of a larger shift in the Silicon Valley tech scene towards conservative politics and military contracting. Karp himself embodies this change, going from a self-described neo-Marxist and longtime Democrat to an outspoken supporter of Elon Musk, Doge, and the second Trump administration. The former philosophy student has a clear worldview that has driven Palantir since its founding.
In Silicon Valley, we build businesses around an idea, and then we figure out how we're going to make money. And this is incredibly important because if you want something to really work, something really complicated, you cannot hire people who are motivated by a paycheck.
Karp's increasingly frequent and outrageous media appearances have become an integral part of Palantir's brand.
You need a higher purpose, and I also think you often need a lower purpose. Like the higher purpose for me...
What's a lower purpose?
Well, I love the idea of getting a drone and having light fentanyl-laced urine spraying on analysts who've tried to screw us.
This persona has garnered him a large following of retail investors, hoping to see Palantir stock continue its dramatic rise. With the publication of his first book, The Technological Republic, earlier this year, Karp is attempting to position himself as a thought leader within the new tech scene. As Palantir gains more and more government contracts and is tasked with building Trump's centralized database on American citizens, it is as important as ever to ask, who is Alex Karp? What does he believe? And should we trust him, and by extension Palantir, with all of our data? Karp was born in New York City in 1967 to a Jewish father and an African-American mother. Raised in Philadelphia, he grew up in a politically active household, going to left-wing protests as a young child.
My family, my mother, father, but also extended family are, you could imagine like something like the physics department at Princeton meets an art colony. And my mom was a professional artist, and my dad is a pediatrician for underserved communities. But
after high school, he attended Haverford College and Stanford Law School. While later in life, he would say he hated his time at Stanford, it was there where he would meet his future Palantir co-founder, Peter Thiel. While today, Thiel is famous for his involvement with PayPal and ties to the Republican Party, at the time he was only known for the Stanford Review, a conservative libertarian newspaper he started as an undergrad. Despite Karp's progressive politics, the two became friends, bonding over a shared love of philosophical debate.
Peter and I very much disagreed on the outcomes of the suppositions of our arguments, but we very much agreed on what it meant to make a strong argument. And we would battle over political. He was then more kind of, as now, more on the right. I was at the time a classic progressive, still am.
After graduation, Karp moved to Germany, eventually pursuing a PhD in philosophy at Goethe University in Frankfurt.
And then you went to Frankfurt?
Then I went to Frankfurt
A
and got
PhD in neoclassical...
social philosophy, which is a fancy way of saying a quick path to being unemployed.
He claims that at first, he worked under Jürgen Habermas, one of the most renowned philosophers of the 20th century, but had to switch advisors after a disagreement over his thesis topic. Some have disputed this claim, arguing that Habermas was in a different department and that it's unlikely him and Karp ever worked together. After finishing his thesis in 2002, Karp would decide the life of an academic wasn't for him.
And I thought that while the ideas were important, the actual impact they were going to have was going to be very small. I mean, the kind of work I did was intelligible to probably 30, 40 people in the world. So it seemed more interesting and compelling to do something else.
When I was there, I dealt with the best of the best of the best of the best, and that taught me I was good enough to be a professor at Columbia in a tenure, but I was not going to be them.
It is after this point that the timeline of Karp's life becomes somewhat difficult to nail down. It's unclear how much of this is intentional or a feature of his low profile at the time. Like his work with Habermas, it is often difficult to verify many of the myths surrounding Karp and Palantir, especially during this early period. In most interviews, Karp says that during this time he received an inheritance from his grandfather, which he used to start an asset management firm called the Cadman Group. According to him, his fund was so successful that wealthy European clients began investing their money with him. When describing what the Cadman Group actually did for its clients, Karp often remains extremely vague.
It turned out I had a facility for, I was pretty good at making money, and I was very bad at getting paid. So I basically turned the ability to make money and get paid into a business where I looked for other people who were good at making money and bad at getting paid, and I taught them how to make money quicker and to get paid fairly.
Now, this was kind of a venture capital kind of operation, or?
Basically my own business, which I built, and I went around looking for motley people who had academic proclivities and were interested in business, and I would approach them and say, oh, why don't you build a business? I'll help you. And I did that for a couple years, and then I reconnected with Peter.
It was through the Cadman Group that Karp and Thiel would first start working together, with Karp finding clients for Thiel's investment firm, Clarium Capital. Or at least that is how the story is sometimes told. In another version, Thiel reached out to Karp out of the blue to run his new company, Palantir, with no mention of their previous work together. In a completely different version, Karp says he moved back to the US in 2000, only later to reconnect with his former friend. When Thiel tells the story, he makes no mention of Clarium Capital. Instead, he claims the two met at the Jewish Philanthropy Partnership in San Francisco and began brainstorming ideas for a new company together. Unfortunately, I can't find any records of this organization. What I think he may be referring to is the Institute for Jewish and Community Research, a think tank through which Karp published in 2002. In fact, in his filings for 2004 and 2005, the organization lists Karp as a full-time employee making a healthy salary, further complicating his backstory. In my opinion, these conflicting stories likely come from Karp wanting to exaggerate his business experience to appear more qualified for his new role at Palantir. According to Clarium Capital's own SEC filings, it wasn't until 2010 that they began working with the Cadman Group, putting into question that version of events. Additionally, I find it odd that there is no record of Karp's grandfather online, given that only a portion of his wealth was enough to start a legitimate investment firm. In all fairness, though, Karp does offer an explanation for why some of his backstory may not add up.
One of the crazy things about my life is who pretends now they never knew me, didn't work with me. It's like you would think German academia would be like, yeah, we finally got someone with a salary, but it's like I've been disappeared. It's like the artist that formerly worked at this building, they blow up the building.
Whatever the case may be, what is known for sure is that in 2003, Thiel gathered several former PayPal employees and Karp to form Palantir. The company was born out of an idea to use PayPal's anti-fraud software to predict and prevent possible terror attacks. Palantir software offered a novel way to organize and monitor large swaths of data too immense and complex for humans to parse. However, this concept was not as new as it is sometimes presented.
Total information awareness is it's a very Orwellian term, isn't it? It's actually a massive research project conducted by the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or DARPA.
What they want to do is grab a bunch of civilian and military and intelligence agency databases, and they want to go through them looking for patterns that might tip someone off that someone's a bad guy, a malefactor of some description, which on its surface sounds pretty good, except there's no oversight, there's no appeal. The databases are secret, the workings of the database are secret.
The idea was that a potential terrorist would leave a digital trail, but in order to find that trail, you had to collect all of the digital information there was, from anywhere and everywhere that you could find it. If you were to ask Alex Jones to design a logo to make every single neuron in his conspiratorial brain fire, this would be it.
Total Information Awareness was a research project conducted by the Information Awareness Office following the attacks on 9/11. The goal was to integrate several surveillance projects under one office, allowing them to monitor American citizens and look for patterns to predict and prevent possible terrorist attacks. In charge of the office was Admiral John Poindexter, one of the key figures in the Iran-Contra affair.
So TIA is a project under the directorship of 5-time convicted felon John Poindexter.
Yeah, this is baffling that Poindexter is back.
Good
I don't
old, the
understand
dreaded
that.
rear admiral, as we like to call him.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to do something like this, pick somebody a little credible.
Who didn't lie to Congress, who didn't mislead the president, and so on. So,
following significant pushback over privacy concerns, Congress cut the TIA's funding. However, many of the projects continued under the NSA, where their operations could be shielded from the public.
TIA would be, as they say, defunded from the defense budget, but that all the money for it would be moved over to the classified side of the budget, the black budget, as it's often called. And it was disbanded in name, and all of the various components of the research program were separated, were given new cover names, and almost all of them were then shifted over to the management and control of the National Security Agency.
Curiously, it is the same year this program is being defunded that Palantir emerges, offering similar services. Mark Bowden, in The Finish, The Killing of Osama bin Laden, would describe Palantir as a program that elegantly accomplished what the TIA had set out to do. The private sector would offer an avenue for the government to surveil civilians with less congressional oversight. In fact, both Alex Karp and Peter Thiel met with John Poindexter in 2003, explicitly because of his work with the TIA. However, he says he was not impressed with their software and didn't work with them any further.
With President Obama launching an offensive to take down the Islamic State and terror threats rising in Europe, Australia, and potentially right here in the United States, could technology be the key to stopping the next major attack? PayPal co-founder and venture capitalist Peter Thiel, the co-founder of another company called Palantir, certainly thinks so. I spoke with Thiel about the technology behind Palantir and whether it could help stop the next 9/11. Take a listen.
While Poindexter and many other investors were skeptical, the startup was able to convince the CIA to invest $2 million through their venture capital arm in QTEL. According to Karp, the CIA remained their only investor for 5 years, up until 2008. Eventually, Palantir would prove their software's usefulness through a series of high-profile cases. This includes catching Bernie Madoff for financial crimes, stopping a hacking group targeting the Dalai Lama, and possibly locating Osama bin Laden.
It's said sometimes about Palantir in print that your technology was useful to the Obama administration and to the CIA under Leon Panetta in the hunt for Osama bin Laden. Let me just ask you, was that true?
Well, you know, Palantir, I mean, it's one of those questions, obviously, when you run a company like mine, you're never allowed to answer.
One tactic Palantir used to gain these early clients was to give their software away for free. For example, when the US Army refused to purchase Palantir software, they began to give it away to individual units in Afghanistan. This was done with the hopes that soldiers would learn to trust the software and eventually pressure the higher-ups into purchasing an expensive contract. This aggressive strategy worked. By 2013, TechCrunch reports that their government contracts included, but were not limited to, work with the CIA, DHS, NSA, FBI, CDC, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, the Recovery Accountability and Transparency Board, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children.
So would you say that Palantir has helped thwart multiple terrorist plots?
I suspect that's true.
One of the key selling points of Palantir during this period, especially in the anti-terror context, was how it was different from earlier approaches in the Bush era.
And the second piece is, how do you do it so that when the government is looking at you or me, it's clear that they're looking at you and me for a reason. If they bring a case against us, what is the case? Where did the evidence come from? Did it come from sources they were allowed to see?
A lot of the reason why my company succeeded was, in the beginning, post 9/11, everyone was like, oh, find terrorists, we don't care how. Most of our investors were like, find terrorists, we don't care how. And you make lots of mistakes when you do things, and I may have made a lot of mistakes. One of the best decisions I ever made was reflecting upon Hegel. We can have a dialectic. We're going to find terrorists and protect data protection.
We needed to have more security with fewer violations of civil liberties, fewer intrusions of privacy. And I felt that the low-tech debate version of this was sort of a Luddite ACLU versus, a heavy-handed, dumb airport security where, one silly shoe bomber makes everyone take their shoes off for 2 decades after that.
Because if you just find the terrorist and you abandon civil liberties, you lose half the society. In my view, correctly. Do you want everyone knowing what you do in your personal life? I don't. And I think it's our God-given right to have parts of our personal lives that are protected. You can't, but if you don't find the terrorists, and this is where I disagree with a lot of my academic friends, you're going to have goose-stepping in the streets.
Palantir's primary security system is a tagging feature that tracks how clients are using the software and keeps a log of how individuals' data is being viewed. The idea was that the government wouldn't spy on information it wasn't allowed to because it knew its actions were being tracked. However, these logs are useless without a third party looking through them. This key part of Palantir's promise of security is still, to this day, yet to be fulfilled. Because so much of this government work is classified, to understand the capabilities of Palantir's software, it's easier to look at their work for commercial clients. For example, here are the services they provided to JPMorgan Chase during this time. Aided by as many as 120 forward-deployed engineers from the data mining company Palantir Technologies Incorporated, which JPMorgan engaged in 2009, Covicia's group, JPMorgan's internal security team, vacuumed up emails and browser histories, GPS locations from company-issued smartphones, printers and download activity, and transcripts of digitally recorded phone conversations. Palantir software aggregated, searched, sorted, and analyzed these records, surfacing keywords and patterns of behavior that Covicia's team had flagged for potential abuse of corporate assets. Palantir's algorithm, for example, alerted the insider threat team when an employee started badging into work later than usual, a sign of potential disgruntlement. That would trigger further scrutiny and possible physical surveillance after hours by bank personnel. What is so insidious about Palantir's software is that it allows for increased surveillance without the implementation of any new hardware. The platform allows for systems already in place to be used to their full potential. While before you could safely assume that no one would spend the time to listen to your personal calls, now the time to do so is negligible. Ironically, the JPMorgan contract was only ended after it was exposed that the internal team was using their software against the company's own executives.
At first glance, you might think this is a typical Silicon Valley startup, complete with free food, toys, dogs in the hallway, and a 24/7 work ethic.
There's the bed. It is particularly sad when I only live 4 blocks away, so I'm tired when I'd rather sleep here than walk home.
But when these young engineers aren't battling each other in a game of Halo 3 or Turbo Hearts, they're engaged in a very different type of endeavor: counterterrorism.
In contrast to the company's distinctly Orwellian project and professional clients, in the early 2010s, its culture matched any other Silicon Valley startup. As described in a Forbes 2013 piece, their Palo Alto office features a conference room turned giant plastic ball pit and has floors littered with Nerf darts and dog hair. Staffers, most of whom choose to wear Palantir-branded apparel daily, spend so much time at the office that they leave their toothbrushes by the bathroom sinks.
Welcome to paradise, my man. You can chill over there by the bar. We also got basketball at any time you want with Roy Hibbert and Detlef Schrempf.
Oh my God, that's an actual NBA player.
Palantir would hold parties and hackathons that are now a time capsule 2010 Silicon Valley culture.
Turning away a lot of people, so I'm just hoping the seams don't crack.
I would guess they'll be bankrupt by the end of this sentence.
There were some complaints about the frat-like environment at the company, with one employee complaining about a beer pong-related injury and an allergic reaction to the dog hair around the office. Karp himself embodied the wacky CEO archetype that startups were meant to have. As Forbes describes him, he's eccentric, a lifelong bachelor, can solve a Rubik's Cube in less than 3 minutes, practices Qigong daily, and is known for putting co-founders in martial arts holds in the hallway. However, his academic background differentiated him from the typical college dropout CEO. Part of the reason Karp was picked for the position is because he could describe what Palantir did to its clients and journalists in a language understandable by non-tech people. His experience in academia also allowed him to articulate Palantir's mission in a softer, more progressive tone that emphasized how much the company cared about protecting civil liberties. When pressed with criticism of the company's practices, Karp would often fall back on his own identity and philosophy to reassure critics of the company's trustworthiness. We have to find places that we protect away from the government so that we can all be the unique and interesting, and in my case, somewhat deviant people we'd like to be. Like many Silicon Valley startups, Palantir's public image became deeply intertwined with that of its founder. But unique to Karp is how his personal philosophy and progressive politics were projected onto the company itself. As senior engineer Ari Gesher put it, he's our conscience. Much of the early reporting on Palantir focused on how this progressive ethos influenced the company's practices. They claimed to be very selective with who they worked with, losing 20% of their revenue by turning down unsavory clients such as tobacco companies and the Saudi government. This also came with philanthropic work for humanitarian causes, such as organizing aid groups in the recovery from Hurricane Sandy.
Palantir has provided their technology platform to help disaster response organizations better analyze information and mobilize their resources after a large-scale event. Using Palantir mobile devices, Direct Relief can perform health facility assessments to determine how many patients are being treated and whether they need additional medical supplies for people who are either injured or displaced and in need of their medications.
It is through this work that Palantir would connect with Bill Clinton, who can be seen here amazed at its software. This work led to Palantir partnering with the Clinton Foundation. Well, either that or the $100,000 he donated specifically for a one-on-one meeting with Bill. Looking back, a lot of this progressive posturing seems like a front to hide the uglier side of Palantir's software. Regardless of how much Karp talked about wanting to protect civil liberties, the company was still being used to monitor and track people in uncomfortably invasive ways. And it wasn't long before cracks in the facade began to show, and it became obvious that the company wasn't always as principled with their practices as they would like the public to believe. Palantir's first major scandal came in 2011. As part of a larger hack of the company HB Gary by Anonymous, a series of emails were released to the public of their correspondences with Palantir. These emails detail 2 project proposals made as a collaboration between HB Gary, Palantir, and Barrico Technologies, under the umbrella group Team Themis. The first was a pitch to Bank of America, who was concerned with a potential hack by WikiLeaks. The 3 software companies offered to track the organization's members, launch cyber attacks on its servers, and spread disinformation about its supporters. While it was the other 2 companies who offered to do the truly invasive aspects of the project, Palantir's logo can still be seen on every slide of the presentation. The second proposal was a pitch to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the largest lobbying group in the U.S. Team Themis offered to discredit, confuse, shame, combat, infiltrate, and fracture the protest groups who opposed them. The proposal advertised how the 3 software companies could help their large clients combat the often decentralized groups who got in their way. To give the potential client a taste of the software's capability, Palantir mapped out the members of Chamber Watch, a project by the nonprofit consumer advocacy group Public Citizen that often opposed the Chamber's actions. Team Themis gathered data on its key members and how other organizations were connected to its network. In these correspondences, HB Gary's employee said about Palantir's software, "Yep, pretty scary how easy it is to gather info. I like it." Thankfully, both clients declined these proposals. However, these plans show a willingness by Palantir to engage in invasive spying to disrupt progressive organizations from exercising their right to free speech and protest. This goes against their own stated promise of avoiding contracts involving invasive targeting.
First of all, we've always made the decision not to be involved in intrusive software, so offensive attacks in the cyber context, precisely this context, because in the cyber context, intrusive infiltrations are questionable often.
In response, Karp denied any knowledge of these proposals and publicly apologized to those the company had targeted. The blame was placed on a single Palantir employee who had overseen the partnership and helped author the proposals. The company hired an outside firm to investigate the incident, which eventually found that the employee should be rehired, which he was. Even if the heads of Palantir didn't know about these proposals, which I personally doubt, they show the potential harm the products can cause, not if they are abused, but if they are used as advertised. Additionally, when in private, Karp said, "We've never had a scandal that was really our fault," undermining the authenticity of his public statement. If he doesn't see this work as an issue for the company, what's to say they haven't offered similar services to other clients since then? After these two proposals were made public, Reuters would report on their next controversy as their third black eye, as they were accused of stealing trade secrets from a competing company, i2 Technologies. Shyam Sankar, the now CTO and executive vice president of the company, is accused of licensing i2 software through a shell company run by his family. Allegedly, Palantir would use this access to improve their own software from 2006 to 2010. Eventually, the suit would be settled for $10 million out of court, and i2 would be bought by IBM the next year. The irony here of a surveillance company suing another surveillance company over corporate espionage is hard to ignore. In 2017, Palantir would face yet another scandal, this time in connection to Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica is reported to have harvested data from over 50 million Facebook accounts, scraping the information from friends of users who were paid to take personality quizzes on their own separate app. This data was then used to profile and persuade voters for both the Trump 2016 campaign and the Brexit campaign in the UK. Facebook was scrutinized for failing to protect users' privacy, with the company being fined $5 billion by the FTC, and Mark Zuckerberg questioned in front of Congress.
Mr. Zuckerberg, would you be comfortable sharing with us the name of the hotel you stayed in last night?
While it was buried in the coverage of Facebook's wrongdoing, Palantir was also partially responsible for Cambridge Analytica's work. Several Palantir employees had helped create the profiling tool and were the ones that suggested the company build its own app in the first place. Christopher Wiley, the whistleblower at Cambridge Analytica, makes it clear that this was not an official contract with Palantir, but individuals at the company did help Cambridge Analytica with its software.
Clarify one point. That was not an official contract between Palantir and Cambridge Analytica, but there were Palantir staff who would come into the office and work on the data, and we would go and meet with Palantir staff at Palantir.
At first, Palantir completely rejected the idea that they had any involvement with Cambridge Analytica, later changing their statement, suggesting that an individual employee had worked on the data collected from Facebook profiles, but only in a personal capacity, and not as part of their role at Palantir. The company showed the Times emails detailing how they had rejected Cambridge Analytica's proposal to work with them in the past, citing their policy against working for election campaigns. However, according to emails with John Podesta, Karp had been willing to break this rule before.
The data mining firm Palantir faces backlash over its partnership with ICE. The government agency paid the company $800 million last year. Palantir's services include digital profiling tools, which are reportedly being used to investigate undocumented immigrants and compile evidence against them. Some employees say that those tools are violating the civil liberties of immigrants.
While these controversies may have soured Palantir's image to some, it wasn't until 2017 and its work with the Trump administration that the company faced real backlash. Palantir was under increased public scrutiny for its 2014 contract with the Department of Homeland Security after the Trump administration ramped up its deportation efforts at the start of his first term. The company had created and maintained a system called ICM, or Investigative Case Management. The system would allow ICE to centralize a, quote, vast ecosystem of data to facilitate immigration officials in both discovering and then creating and administering cases against them. Palantir was blamed for facilitating the often cruel deportations and family separations carried out by ICE. leading to massive backlash from the progressive tech scene. Organizations such as Amnesty International argue that the company was not doing enough to stop the potential human rights abuses done with their software. Protests were held outside the company's offices, and Palantir was barred from university job fairs and progressive tech conferences. Initially, the company claimed that its software was only used for non-deportation immigration work. However, according to the New York Times, it was being used to plan arrests and deportations within the country. Despite over 200 employees signing a letter for the company to drop the DHS as a client, Palantir renewed the contract for $42 million. Here are 2 interviews with Karp from 2020, where he finally admits that the company is involved in deportations and explains why they decided to renew the contract.
Places you've been criticized is for your work at the border with immigration and customs enforcement. Was there ever a time that you wished you had not done work for ICE?
Absolutely. Completely.
You wish you'd never done it?
No. You asked, is there ever a time? Did I suffer? Look, everyone in my family thinks voting for Biden is right of center. I've had some of my favorite employees leave.
Over ICE?
Over ICE. I had people protesting me, some of whom I think asked really legitimate questions. I have asked myself, if I were younger at college, would I be protesting me?
It sounds like yes. What is their most valid criticism?
That if you are involved in anything that one instance of injustice doesn't tarnish all instances of justice. One of our contracts is at ICE, and we started this contract under Obama, and obviously there is a lot of concern, legitimate concern, about what happens on our border, how it happens, and what does the enforcement look like. Certainly, it's a de minimis part of our work, finding people in our country who are undocumented, but it's a legitimate, complex issue. My personal position is we acknowledge the complexity. The people protesting, whom I respect, should also acknowledge the complexity. Is this an issue that is controversial and complex enough that the small island in Silicon Valley that would love to decide what you eat, how you eat, and monetize all your data should not also decide who lives in your country and on what your conditions? There are elections, there are rules, they should be enforced. A transfer of one presidency to another, and the view of Silicon Valley that we get to decide should not be the way these things are decided. Of course, this led to protests. My house has been protested for many months, almost every day. Our office has been protested. Many Palantirians who do not just follow what I say, but are critical people, protested against it internally. Some people were so upset by it that they left. These are very hard decisions. I respect the people that decide they can't be involved in this, but we have a position.
And are you comfortable, though, with the Trump administration's approach on the border?
Look, everybody who knows me personally like you knows that I've been a card-carrying progressive my whole life. My family is progressive. I have a degree in what amounts to progressive thought. Obviously, there are many things I would do differently, and I've never stopped being critical of this administration. I'm not planning to vote for this administration. So there are things I do differently.
Before I talk about Karp's argument here, I want to discuss another similar event that happened in Silicon Valley around the same time, and then talk about them together.
Artificial intelligence, drones, warfare, and Google. It's a mixture that caused an uproar inside the tech giant where the early motto was "Don't be evil."
In 2018, Google faced backlash from employees over a military contract titled Project Maven. The goal of the project was to help the Pentagon's image detection software, which would be used on the battlefield in identifying and possibly striking targets. A letter requesting an end to the contract received over 3,100 signatures from Google employees. The letter itself focused on potential damages to Google's brand if they continued with the contract. Other concerns raised by protesters included their own personal qualms working on military tech, while others were more worried about the potential for AI to be making life-or-death decisions on the battlefield. Eventually, Google came to a compromise, agreeing to carry out the contract, but refusing to renew it after it was over. At the time, Thiel came out against Google's decision, arguing they were supplying the same technology to China and thus betraying their own country. Karp would echo these points in later interviews.
Part of our history was both being born in Silicon Valley and then leaving Silicon Valley. I think the first thing industry needs to do is affirm that if it's going to work with adversaries, it should always supply at least as good a technology to our services and the people who are defending our nation, which, in the past has not been the case.
Conveniently, it would be Palantir which would pick up the contract after Google left it, showing once again that they are a reliable contractor for the US, regardless of the political climate in the Valley.
You have reportedly taken over Project Maven from Google, which was a very controversial program in Silicon Valley.
Well, I can't discuss the specifics of a classified program, but I can say if this were true, I'd be very proud.
The controversy over these two contracts is really where Palantir began to differentiate itself from other Silicon Valley tech companies. In 2020, the company would actually move out of the Valley to Denver, Colorado.
You know, at Palantir, we have our views. Many times those views have been very controversial. We picked up and moved to Denver because our views were too controversial in Silicon Valley.
In criticizing Google's decision and defending his own, Karp uses many of the same arguments, so I think it is worth considering them here together. In an op-ed Karp wrote for the Washington Post, he argues that for both the ICE and Maven contracts, Silicon Valley companies should not be the ones making the decisions on policy. Even though he disagrees with some of the policies of the Trump administration, if they are voted in by the American people, he thinks tech companies should not use their outsized power to reject this decision by the public. This is especially important in AI, where the threat of being outcompeted by other nations is so high.
Do we want a motley crew of people in Silicon Valley who build platforms deciding which institutions work, under what conditions, what is the execution, which institutions, by the way, don't work, and under what conditions? Many people believe, I happen to share this belief, that the present and the future ability to control the rule of law and its application will be determined by our ability to harness and master artificial intelligence and its precursor, machine learning.
Yeah.
It is a very, very radical decision to say you will not help the US on this. Now, I believe it's every right of Google and their engineers to make a decision. I believe that, however, that they should not be making this decision. I don't think any other consumer internet should make a decision. US legislators and voters should make these decisions.
The problem with his argument is that he is married to the idea that military tech must be contracted out to private institutions, companies which, given their nature as separate entities from the government, are not obligated to take on contracts they disagree with. One way to take power away from these companies would be to do the AI research in-house and not rely on private contractors. However, that system would eliminate the need for companies like Palantir, which survive off these government contracts. This puts Karp in an impossible situation where he wants to condemn Google for putting the company's interests over the country's, but needs to endorse a system that relies on their ability to do so. In his article, he says, "No company should have to work for the government. The challenge is when they want to accept lucrative law enforcement or military contracts with one hand while stiff-arming the government with the other." He tries to clarify here why he opposes Google ending the contract, but doesn't endorse forcing companies to work for the government. What he comes up with doesn't match on to the reality of the situation. Google did not accept a lucrative contract. That is what Karp is complaining about. He's acting as if they are still getting paid but refusing to provide the product. Maybe what he is saying is that if a company has taken government contracts in the past, they must take them in the future. However, this is the same as saying that military contractors must take on any project even if they disagree with it. I agree with Karp that tech elites, like him, have outsized power in our society and should not be able to dictate the nation's policy. However, if Google having this power threatens national security, the solution to this imbalance is to reduce the government's reliance on these private contractors, not to stop them from exercising their right to refuse the government a service. Another piece of Palantir's work that often receives pushback is its collaboration with local law enforcement. Palantir has had contracts with the LAPD, New Orleans PD, the NYPD, and others. Their system allows departments to create databases of, quote, names, addresses, phone numbers, license plates, friendships, and romances on a variety of individuals, regardless of whether they have committed any crime. Using this information, people's personal connections are mapped and patterns are identified. Stanford Associate Professor Sarah Brain describes this system as a secondary surveillance network, where individuals who do not have direct contact with law enforcement are surveilled solely due to their connection to persons of interest. This can all be done without a warrant, as each individual piece of surveillance is allowed and there is no legal restriction against putting them together. Brain describes how the LAPD would assign individuals points or risk scores to determine how likely they are to commit crimes in the future. This system can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, as individuals with interactions with police are given higher scores, leading to more police scrutiny, leading to even higher scores. What is most insidious about these programs is that they are often implemented without going through the public procurement process. To avoid public scrutiny, Palantir often donates their services to police departments in return for gaining access to citizens' data to train their systems. In New Orleans, for example, this program operated for years without anyone outside the mayor's office, the city attorney, and the police department knowing. Once citizens learned about the program, there was backlash and it was promptly shut down. A spat between Palantir and the NYPD actually raises an important question about the level to which Palantir owns citizens' data. Palantir argued that it had ownership over the analysis done by its software, so when the NYPD wanted to switch to a different program and end their $3.5 million a year contract with Palantir, the company refused to hand over the analysis the software had already done. While they agreed that the data itself was owned by the NYPD, the conclusions and connections realized by the software was proprietary and cannot be transferred to a different system. This challenges Palantir's often repeated defense that they are not the ones who own your data.
If you're in England, you assume that when a private company touches your data, that they're going to use it for their purposes.
Yes.
Palantir doesn't do that?
Yeah, but you might in the future.
We've never done it in 20 years.
Sure, but you may in the future.
Well, first of all, we wouldn't even be able to. So the way our product is set up, I don't have access to your data. Our product does not allow you to do that.
It does appear they have control over the conclusions gathered from the data, which is arguably more invasive and comprehensive. Once a client ends its contract with Palantir, what is stopping them from using the conclusions of its software for its own ends as a private company, no longer tied to the interests of the government, which originally gave them access? Despite the company's purported concerns for civil liberties, when faced with putting the interests of citizens over their clients, Karp often falls back on the legality of Palantir's actions. When individuals raise concerns over their use of license plate cameras for the LAPD, he argued that Palantir's only obligation was to follow the law, which they were already doing. This is rich coming from Karp, who lives in a remote cabin in New Hampshire, has 24/7 security, and has devices installed to stop people from listening in to his office conversations. When he is so protective of his own privacy, what gives him the right to tell anyone else what they should and shouldn't be concerned about his company knowing? Despite Palantir's numerous high-profile clients, up until very recently, its financials have been anything but stable. In 2016, BuzzFeed reported that Palantir was struggling to keep its corporate clients. Companies like Coca-Cola, American Express, and NASDAQ had all walked away from their contracts, primarily citing Palantir's high prices as the reason for their departure. The company was also facing pressure from within. In 2016, Palantir lost around 20% of its staff, quote, almost double the average rate of the 3 previous years. While in the past, Palantir had prided itself on its moderate salaries compared to other startups, it offered a pay raise to employees who stayed at the company for longer than 18 months. At the same time, employees were complaining that they could not find buyers for the Palantir stock many had taken in lieu of higher salaries. Since the company had yet to go public, these shares could only be sold on private markets where demand was dwindling. The problem continued into at least 2019, where New York Magazine reports, quote, insiders may be struggling to sell their equity and options in Palantir in the secondary market. In addition to this internal unhappiness, the company itself had lost nearly $600 million for the second year in a row. While it is not unusual for tech startups to go years without turning a profit, Palantir was almost 15 years old at this point, and confidence in the company's longevity was waning.
Took 17 years, but Palantir now looks ready to make its public market debut. Remember, this company was co-founded by Peter Thiel back in 2003. Company says revenue grew 25% in 2019, and in the first 6 months of this year, nearly 50%, but it's still not making a profit, posting a net loss of about $165 million.
In 2020, Palantir finally answered the calls and decided to go public. While the company had been signaling a public offering for years, in the past, Karp had railed against the practice, arguing that it would hamstring the company's ability to operate effectively.
The problem with being a public company is that it can be culturally corrosive on the inside. You look at Foundry, which is used to power the COVID crisis, or PG, which is powering most Intel services in the world. These products were built over the course of years, and they were derided. Barely anyone wanted to invest in us. We almost went out of business a number of times. And we didn't have somebody in Wall Street, quite frankly, who has no earthly clue what they're talking about, telling us, you can't build this because there's no product or no market for it. But when you're public, their view means a lot more, and it's harder to tell them, hey, look, I know this looks like something no one needs, but they'll need it in 10 years.
Despite Karp's own inhibitions, in 2020, the company did a DPO, or direct public offering, creating no new shares upon going public. This strategy would allow insiders to sell their shares without dilution, reinforcing the idea that this move was primarily to appease those unhappy insiders. Forbes suggests an alternative motive, that the move could be an attempt for the company to gain legitimacy and ultimately help it acquire more commercial clients. While the stock would rise in 2020 in response to the company's work tracking COVID cases, it would eventually return to its listing price. If the DPO was helping the company in the corporate world, this wasn't reflected yet in the stock price.
Do you think Wall Street truly understands what Palantir is doing, particularly on the commercial side, particularly given the fact the stock's down something like 60% this year?
Well, I think Wall Street largely understands we're a tech company and punishes all tech companies right now. The interesting thing about Palantir is all of our products historically, whether it's our Intel product, or it's the mapping toggle, it's the AI product that's now changed the world, the product that we built for distributed vaccine have been 5 years ahead of the market. Our commercial offering is 5 years ahead, 3-4 years ahead of what Wall Street probably understands. And by the way, I would also say Palantir has always been over and undervalued, and clearly we're undervalued, but at some point we'll be overvalued again.
As is the nature of war contracting, chaos and bloodshed in the world means opportunity for Palantir. In 2022, as Russia escalated its invasion of Ukraine, Palantir stepped in to provide technological assistance to the Ukrainian army. On the battlefield, Palantir software helped plan logistics and track enemy movements using data gathered from satellite and drone imagery.
We build products that allow you to do very high-end AI-enabled targeting. Most of the details we can't discuss, but our adversaries are very, very well aware now of their impact. These products have changed the course of history. Our product is used on occasion to kill people.
This is drone targeting, or what is this?
Targeting of all kinds. If you're looking for a terrorist in the world now, you're probably using our government product, and you're probably doing the operation that actually takes out the person in another product we build.
In 2024, after the terrorist attacks in Israel, Palantir jumped on the opportunity to strengthen their ties with the Israeli Defense Force. This was not wholly unprecedented for the company. The New York Times reported in 2014 that they were working with the Israeli military, and they opened an office in Tel Aviv in 2015. However, it was after October 7th that Karp and the company became increasingly outspoken in their support of the Israeli state through a series of social media posts, a full-page ad in the New York Times, and by holding their next board meeting in Tel Aviv. This public support helped Palantir secure an elusive contract with the IDF, one whose details remain confidential. The company received backlash for this contract and public stand, losing employees and facing yet another round of protests. While it is not public what Palantir is doing with the Israeli military, the recently exposed Lavender system bears a striking resemblance to the company's work with US police forces and the Ukrainian military. For example, here is an excerpt from a presentation given by a colonel in the IDF's Cyber Intelligence Agency, showing how their system determines individuals' likelihood to be Hamas operatives. This system is extremely similar to the network-based threat assessment system Palantir implemented in the LAPD. Karp himself has admitted that Palantir is used to kill people in Gaza.
Mostly terrorists, that's true.
Thiel has also had the opportunity to deny the company's involvement with the Lavender program, which he very gracefully avoided doing.
What do you think about the use of artificial intelligence, or Lavender, by the IDF in identifying Hamas targets?
Look, I'm not, without going into all the
I'm not on top of all the details of what's going on in Israel because my bias is to defer to Israel. It's not for us to second guess everything, and I believe that broadly the IDF gets to decide what it wants to do, and that they're broadly in the right, and that's sort of the perspective I come back to. And
to be clear, Palantir is not the only tech company that works with the Israeli military on artificial intelligence and battlefield software. Google also rushed to meet the country's new military needs after October 7th. However, given the Lavender system's similarity to other Palantir projects, I don't believe it is a stretch to think their software and engineers were involved in its design and implementation. The Lavender system, described by 972, uses Israel's surveillance network across the Gaza Strip to create profiles of each resident, giving them a score from 1 to 100 based on how likely they are to be a militant of Hamas or the PIJ. If an individual receives a high enough score, they are linked to a home, often shared with their family, and are selected for targeting. Under the program named Where's Daddy, the system would automatically alert an officer when the individual had returned home and could be targeted with an airstrike. IDF officials were given 20 seconds to check the algorithm's work for each target, and were only responsible for confirming that the individual was male. After this approval, the system would launch a strike on their home. This entire system, or kill chain as Palantir calls it,
and you have created the system which you call kill chain
privately,
involves no human confirmation as to whether the individual and their family deserve to die, or whether they had even been correctly identified. This responsibility was entrusted entirely to the AI system, despite the fact that it had a 10% error rate. The IDF became increasingly reliant on this system after October 7th, as the military greatly expanded the scope of its targeting program. Instead of focusing solely on head Hamas officials, after the attacks, all suspected militants were permitted for assassination in their homes, regardless of rank. Contributing to the high number of casualties in Gaza, including women and children, is the reported IDF policy that 15 to 20 civilian casualties were permissible for each strike on a suspected Hamas militant. For the higher-ranking officials, as many as 100 civilian deaths were allowed. In these assassinations, according to 972 sources, the IDF would intentionally use dumb bombs, or non-targeting missiles, which were cheaper but caused more civilian casualties as they were less precise. What makes this situation even more concerning is that Palantir software is also used by several other organizations in the region whose data could be exploited by the IDF if they are given access. This includes the UN's aid program in the Gaza Strip, as well as the International Atomic Energy Agency, which monitors Iran's nuclear development. The precision of Israel's strikes on Iran suggests they have access to information similar to what may be in Palantir's system already. While Karp has promised that data is not shared between clients, given the company's history of deceptive practices, the international community should not be trusting them with this responsibility. These practices show the dangers of software like Palantir's. Regardless of the supposed ethics of the company, their systems amplify their clients' ability to do harm. Even if these software companies are not making the decisions as to how their systems are being used, they are still responsible for the people killed with their products. While Karp loves to talk about his high-minded values, he remains quiet as his software is used to target and kill civilians. Karp defends the company's involvement with the IDF as part of their defense of the West and Western values. He argues that other parts of the world do not care about human lives the way we do, and that we must scare them into submission. But at what point do you lose this moral righteousness? When have you sunk to the callous disregard for human lives that you were attempting to stop? And at what point is it fair to question whether you really cared about those high-minded ideals you were supposedly fighting for from the beginning?
Alex, as always, we have a lot of individual investors on the line. Is there anything you'd like to say before we
We're doing it. We're doing it. And I'm sure you're enjoying this as much as I am.
Palantir surging more than 20% to record highs.
The stock that has divided analysts, even as it soared nearly 400% in the past 12 months.
What a difference a few years makes, right? Silicon Valley's relationship with government defense and intelligence went from the reluctant and the uncomfortable to really the strategic and the interdependent.
To say we did it our way is a minimization of what that meant.
This amounts to a new tech order. The new darlings, they're starting to emerge here, and that's Anduril, Palantir, SpaceX.
We are dedicating our company, we have dedicated our company to the service of the West and the United States of America, and we're super proud of the role we play, especially in places we can't talk about.
Now, on the Palantir earnings call last night, CEO Karp said many times that their U.S. government business is booming. In fact, Karp said he's seeing the adoption of Palantir technology in every part of the U.S. government, including, quote, the White House, Congress, defense, intel.
Palantir is here to disrupt and make the institutions we partner with the very best in the world, and when it's necessary, to scare enemies and on occasion kill them.
Special thanks to our sponsor, Palantir.
In 2024, Palantir's stock began its dramatic rise, increasing by 400% that year alone. Karp himself was the highest paid CEO of any publicly traded company, and in 2024 would be named CEO of the Year by The Economist. There were several factors contributing to the company's sudden increase in value. First is the AI boom across the stock market. Palantir was well positioned to capitalize on the AI frenzy, as their products had built on machine learning for years. Additionally, their business model is somewhat unique compared to other AI companies, as they actually have a source of revenue. While Meta and OpenAI are scrambling to find ways to make back the enormous fortunes they've invested into their chatbots, Palantir's corporate and government customers are more than willing to fork over large amounts of cash for their software. Second is Palantir's use of individual investors to pump the stock. Like other meme stocks such as GameStop or AMC, Palantir has a large group of dedicated retail investors who have rallied around the stock. Karp himself is clearly aware of this community support, using their lingos in his public speeches.
There is something anomalous going on, and obviously the prediction that all the attendees would be downstream from the value, so it would be chips and ontology, is being proven, not as a thesis but as a reality.
Third is the improving relationship between Silicon Valley and the military-industrial complex. This trend can be seen with the successes of companies like SpaceX and Anduril in undercutting more established contractors. This work also provides them with a guaranteed inflow of cash, something many tech companies in social media and entertainment lack. When Karp tells it, he is almost single-handedly responsible for this shift in the Valley.
And I think currently there's not a single large company that would refuse to sell the U.S. military. That's a U.S.-based company.
Why do you think that is?
Because I embarrassed the fuck out of them. And other things.
And to give him credit, Palantir was ahead of the curve in both its politics and business strategy. There has been a conservative shift in the Valley from tech workers to CEOs, and a rejection of the social justice culture which Palantir has fought against for almost a decade. A lot of this conservative shift can be attributed to the Republican Party's embrace of the libertarian politics that have always been present in the Valley. The Trump administration has returned the favor of political support with policies beneficial to the tech community, such as increased funding to development projects through his new budget, ending investigations and prosecutions of large companies and figures in the space, and removing restrictions on AI development. Despite their current alignment, most CEOs in Silicon Valley, including Karp, have had a complicated history with Trump, something that is worth reflecting on in retrospect. Back in 2016, Karp was not supportive of Trump's presidential campaign. As a longtime Democrat and donator to the Clinton campaign, he voiced his dislike for the then candidate in footage obtained by BuzzFeed.
I've had the rare opportunity to meet Trump, which I turned down. I mean, this is off the record, but I don't respect, I respect nothing about the dude. You could almost make up someone that I find, it'd be hard to make up someone I find less appealing. You inherit 50 million in the 70s, and you have, let's just say you have 20 billion now. You guys can do compounding math. That's not a good return. It's so even purely on the vulgar metric of as a business person, then as a person, and then as a bully. In any case, I don't care if you guys vote for him or whatever. I'm just saying, I think Trump, I don't know what's going to happen to him. Quite frankly, would like him to go away. But, he may do very well.
While usually in less harsh language, Karp was not afraid to express his party affiliation publicly. His progressive beliefs were often contrasted with his pro-Trump co-founder Peter Thiel, and were used to dismiss any rumors that the company was receiving favorable treatment by the Trump administration.
You know, there's been a suggestion that Peter Thiel's closeness to the Trump administration, he was a major donor, has somehow benefited Palantir, and I'm curious what you say to that. What is your response to that?
What is true is Peter and I have had a long, deep, and important friendship. I view him as a close friend, and it is true that I value his opinion, and he plays a role at Palantir. It is ludicrous to believe that a relationship between Peter and this administration has helped our company in any material way, especially given the fact that I've clearly been quite obviously and more publicly than I wanted a critic of this administration.
While Karp has often claimed he disagrees with Trump on several issues, he seems to only make this clear when it's beneficial to him and the company. While he said he turned down a meeting with Trump as a candidate, when the president met with a handful of tech CEOs about his new administration, you can pan out and there's Karp. When Trump's immigration policies are unpopular in the Valley, Karp says he disagrees with them.
Therefore, we should throw out all immigrants. Like, who's going to do the work? So it makes no sense. But, you know, you have to ask yourself something that makes no sense, that like de facto is we're bringing up the worst that a society can bring up, which is like blame the people that work really hard and that we need and that are coming here at the risk of their life. Instead of, you know, the dysfunction that you may have helped create. Why is that person so successful?
When Trump's political career looked dire after January 6th, Karp makes his grievances clear.
When I see what happened yesterday, and honestly, when I watched the inflammatory tone of some of our elected leaders that led to this, it's quite concerning, and I would say also depressing. There's a disobedience, a disagreement is crucial to democracy. It's what makes living in a democracy so special. But there's a line where we begin portrayals that corrode the very institutions that preserve this discourse, and that line was crossed. And those of us who've played a crucial role in the enforcement of law especially need to speak up.
However, after the election, Karp has changed his tune and completely embraces Trump and the policies he previously disagreed with.
And there's been a shift in the posture of foreign policy under President Trump when it comes to talking tough. The things that you talk about, what makes America strong in destroying our enemies. Have you been supportive?
I'm super supportive of my version of he's acting tough, and that's why, you know, look at the hostages. All of a sudden we have all these hostages that are free. Some of them are Americans.
And I know you said you're happy with what you're seeing in terms of the foreign policy posture. I'm curious why you didn't support him.
I stayed on the sidelines. I've been historically a Democrat, and I'm very loyal. I'm now an independent. I've been a very unhappy progressive, but, you know, I'm an American first. And I agree with him. I mean, I'm not tracking every decision, but I definitely agree with the national security posture, and I don't think you have a right to be in this country if you're here illegally.
But I think there's also a fear among CEOs to speak out right now. That's why I asked you whether you would be willing to sue this administration, to speak out against this administration for fear of retribution, right? Like, that is part of what's happening here.
I mean, like,
do you not see that?
I don't, honestly, do not see a difference between, like, fear in this administration and last administration. Do you know the number of people who did not agree with Biden that did not speak up?
A large part of his support for this administration seems to come from his admiration of his fellow tech titan, Elon Musk.
At this point, given the fraud, waste, and abuse we know is there, 90% of the country's like, get rid of that fraud, waste, and abuse.
Palantir is very pro-Doge. I'm pro-Doge. I believe it's going to be great for America, and I'm supportive of it. And, you know, read into that what you will.
Right. What the progressive left should be doing is saying, okay, Elon, you're clearly the most qualified person in the world to do something like this. We want to dialogue with you about how you're doing and what you're doing. I don't believe that's actually what happened. And again, I like Elon. I know, I think he's obviously the most important builder in the world. By the way, makes whatever you think of Elon, calling him a Nazi, especially since it seems to be highly correlated to having been supportive of essentially the Hamas wing of the terrorist movement in some way. It's not causation, but is like completely absurd and like a complete rewrite of history. Well, you know.
Thanks to these public appearances, Karp has received several coveted Elon tweets praising him, as well as a growing number of lucrative government contracts. Several Doge staffers were specifically selected due to their previous work at Palantir, and the company was chosen by Doge to create the centralized database that would help them look through the government's data. This full embrace of the MAGA movement has caused some previously loyal Palantirians to question the company's direction, including the senior engineer who previously cited Karp as the company's conscience. I think Karp's politics are best exemplified by this screenshot of his political donations: $265,000 to the Republican NRCC, $360,000 to Harris's presidential campaign, $360,000 to the Republican Grow the Majority, and then, once Trump won, $1 million to the MAGA Inc. PAC.
I stayed on the sidelines. I sat on the sidelines in the last election. I gave a small amount of money to Biden. I didn't give anything after that.
Karp is very outspoken about his politics, but it is difficult to believe he holds any of the convictions he says he does when he is so willing to change his mind when the health of his company is at stake. After researching the history of Palantir and Alex Karp, I have gained a deep distrust of both the man and the company he runs. Whether it is the alleged espionage that helped build Palantir's software, the weaponization of that software to target political enemies, or its use in the ongoing genocide in Gaza, the company's past and present does not inspire trust in its future work with the federal government. However, he does make a good point here.
The minute you go into this death trap of cognitive decline, that the person you don't like is wrong, you are really, really missing the opportunity to go deeper on their thought process and get ideas that will be crucial for your survival.
So to be fair, I think it is worth spending some time looking at Karp's worldview.
Palantir's great, but their fearless leader is batshit crazy. And, you know, he might go off to his commune in New Hampshire.
In 2025, Karp published his first book along with co-author Nicholas Zimiska titled The Technological Republic. Zimiska is the head of corporate affairs and legal counsel to the office of the CEO at Palantir, and while the book is a collaboration, Karp admits almost all the ideas are his.
I think the fair division of labor is 95% of the ideas are mine, but most of the writing is his.
It's hard to tell if this book has had any real impact. They claim it reached #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, something most Billionaire's books achieve, curiously enough, but I can only find record of it hitting #2. It was all over my local Barnes & Noble, but when compared to similar political manifestos, like Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein's Abundance, it generated considerably less online buzz. The only people online I found talking about it were already Palantir fans before its publication, so I don't know if it's reached an audience outside of that sphere. Despite this, it's obviously an attempt by Karp to gain the reputation as a visionary in the tech space, a la Elon Musk or Sam Altman. Given his influence in the Valley and Washington, it could signal where the sector may be going in the future, so I think it's worth taking seriously even if it hasn't yet made waves. The Technological Republic argues that Silicon Valley needs to move away from a focus on consumer goods and towards more important sectors where innovation is needed, such as national defense and policing. The authors blame progressive culture for the lack of business interest in these fields. The public's focus on sensitivity and obsession with tolerance has scared companies away from taking public positions and tackling difficult issues. The book is aimed at liberals and centrists who don't typically identify with conservative rhetoric, but agree that wokeism or cancel culture have become obstacles to real progress. The authors argue that only by rejecting this progressive culture spawning from academia can the country unify once again around a collective identity and brave the complicated issues that our society has ignored for too long. While the book constructs this overarching philosophical narrative, its primary purpose is to defend Palantir and attack its critics. The resulting cultural commentary and political prescriptions are extremely underdeveloped, as every societal problem is proven almost entirely with examples from Palantir's history. The authors repeatedly contradict their own principles to prove that their company's controversies are microcosms of larger societal debates. This framing inevitably presents Palantir, and other companies like it, as the solution to all the country's failings. To paint the billion-dollar company as a disruptive outsider, rather than a product of the very system they are critiquing, the authors must ignore any conversation of systemic issues. Instead, the enemy must be progressive culture, the one thing that differentiates Palantir from other large tech companies. So what do Karp and Zimiska think is so wrong with modern progressive culture, and why should we blame it for the problems they identify in today's society? The current leaders of Silicon Valley, who have constructed the technical empires that now structure our lives, were for the most part raised in a culture nominally reverent of the requirements of justice, but discussion of the vast realm of questions that afflict our moral lives beyond adherence to the basics was essentially off limits. Any inquiry into what constituted a good or virtuous life, or what allegiance to one's country, for example, meant in the modern era, was beyond the meadow of permissible discourse. This generation, the first significant set of graduates from a far more open university system in the United States, was reluctant to limit its options, to exclude the views of others, and to stake out ideological and political stands. The book argues that higher education has taught young people to abandon political beliefs and hierarchies of value to avoid offending others. The over-policing of language on college campuses has created a generation that is afraid to put forward views about the world, beyond any basic commitments to fairness and equality. They trace this trend back to the elimination of Western civilization courses across universities in the 1970s. The authors think that this movement went too far and has scared students away from believing in any larger narratives and towards cultural relativism. They argue that this trend has downstream effects on the way resources are allocated in the progressive tech scene. The book's analysis of campus culture seems to be a strange amalgamation of two popular critiques of the subject: The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom, published in 1987, and The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, published in 2018. While the two critiques are related, with the former's title inspiring the latter, they are written about an environment that changed greatly in the 30 years between the two books. When Karp and Zimiska parrot ideas from The Coddling, their critiques are much more applicable to modern university culture. The idea that public shaming and a focus on sensitivity causes people to walk on eggshells around certain topics is a fair point and worth taking seriously. As Lukianoff and Haidt argue, call-out culture and us versus them thinking are incompatible with educational and research missions of universities, which require free inquiry, dissent, evidence-based argument, and intellectual honesty. However, connecting this phenomenon to Bloom's critique from the 1980s is where their analysis goes astray. In response to the trends of the time, Bloom argued that the student body was moving towards cultural relativism and was losing the moral convictions that guide our society. The recent education of openness has rejected all that. It pays no attention to natural rights or the historical origins of our regime, which are now thought to have been essentially flawed and regressive. It is progressive and forward-looking. It does not demand fundamental agreement or the abandonment of old or new beliefs in favor of the natural ones. It is open to all kinds of men, all kinds of lifestyles, all ideologies. There is no enemy other than the man who is not open to everything. But when there are no shared goals or visions of the public good, is the social contract any longer possible? Bloom's claim is that students have no beliefs and no shared goals, and that they have embraced moral nihilism. By opening discussions to everyone, students have closed themselves off from holding any real convictions. While today's progressivism can trace its roots back to the postmodernism of the 1970s that Bloom is describing, it has evolved significantly since then. This is seen in the difference between this critique and the one found in The Coddling. Lukianoff and Haidt's argument is that students today are too closed off and sheltered from opposing opinions, which is the opposite of the environment Bloom describes. While both characterizations of campus culture include the opposition to the moral superiority of Western civilization, In the modern generation, this is not due to an embrace of cultural relativism or fear of moral hierarchy, but a political and historical critique of that specific concept. The conflation of these two critiques, written 30 years apart, causes Karp and Zamiska to reach the absurd conclusion that today's students are too afraid to hold political positions. This thesis, which is central to later claims in the book, is in my opinion, on its face absurd. Over the past 2 years, as is often the case in times of political division, college campuses have become a hotbed of political activism. These protests have continued despite attempts by administrators and the federal government to stop them. Even if you disagree with these protests, or see flaws in the progressive culture on these campuses, it has clearly not created an environment where students are afraid to express any and all political positions. It would be one thing if the authors wanted to say that certain beliefs are not allowed on college campuses because of the over-policing of language. This is the typical argument repeated in defense of free speech on college campuses, and is the one put forth in the coddling. They argue that the beliefs that are considered to be morally wrong are deemed offensive and potentially harmful. This results in a culture of scrutiny that can be detrimental to honest intellectual debate and learning. However, this is not the argument Karp and Zamiska put forward. While they repeat the same potential downsides, they claim that progressives are actually afraid of any ethical values or worldviews, regardless of what they are. This distorted framing makes the defense of their own position significantly easier. They no longer have to defend their vision of the country, or even Karp's repeated adulation for the West.
I think the West, as a notion and as a principle upon which it is executed again, is obviously superior. And not acknowledging that, because by not acknowledging it or denying it, you could pretend you were smarter or better than you were, has led to enormous problems in our society. That we would get a small percentage of that, and we would end up as a massive, significant, and much more importantly, impactful company that could power the West to its obvious, innate superiority.
Instead, they can simply argue in favor of honest discussion about ethical issues and for the importance of collective identities and narratives, something almost anyone can agree with. Strangely, when Karp talks about the book, he acts like it's a great defense of the West and its values.
If you were to give this book to like the philosophy department, political theory, or literature department of any elite school in this country, they will burn it. They'll burn it for a lot of reasons, but the primary reason they will burn it is, I am not saying all cultures are equal. In fact, I'm saying this nation is incredibly special.
However, throughout the book, they never define the term or explain why they think it's a collective identity worth embracing. Since they characterize progressives as being against any worldview, they are never forced to defend or articulate their own. They use this analysis of woke campus culture to characterize and dismiss the critics of Palantir and other tech companies, revealing the real reason they care about this issue to begin with. For example, in their retelling, the employees at Google weren't protesting Project Maven because they didn't agree with the military's use of AI. They did it because they don't believe in anything. The employees at Google who resisted leveraging the machinery of their company in service of building software for the US military know what they oppose but not what they are for. The problem we are describing is not a principled commitment to pacifism or a non-violence. It is a more fundamental abandonment of belief in anything. Similarly, the ACLU wasn't concerned with Palantir violating civil liberties with their contract with the NOPD. They were just scared of new ideas and technology. The problem is not a fulsome and contentious debate about the merits of incorporating new technologies in the context of policing or criminal investigations. Rather, a fear of the unknown is too often used to abdicate responsibility for navigating any degree of uncertainty or complexity, and indeed the possibility that technology could be misused. The authors portray progressive groups as oppositional to any type of worldview or discussion about difficult moral topics. Rather than addressing the specific complaints raised by critics, they dismiss them all as part of a larger cultural aversion to authentic beliefs. This allows them to avoid having to defend the company's often controversial decisions. And this is what I mean when I say the philosophy is downstream of their desire to defend Palantir. It is impossible to look at modern universities and protests against Palantir and conclude that these people hold no beliefs. However, this is the conclusion the authors must reach in order to paint Palantir's opponents as unreasonable and not worth engaging with. I also think it's worth noting how tame this description is compared to how Karp talks about the culture coming from college campuses in interviews.
We kind of just think these things that are happening across college campuses especially are like a sideshow. No, they are the show. Because if we lose the intellectual debate, you will not be able to deploy any army in the West ever. Why would Hamas ever give up? They have you marching for them. They're never going to give up. You are an infection inside of our society, and they are the reason they're not going to give up. I am not a legislator, but I am running one of the coolest companies in the world, and I'm telling young people, you are breathing the vapors of a dangerous, new, fake, and self-destructive religion when you are sitting at your elite school pretending because you watched TikTok twice and got an A+ on some crazy paper because your professor couldn't get a job anywhere else, that you actually understand the world. And you're not welcome at my company.
Yeah.
This book is clearly an attempt to reel in Karp's ramblings and condense them into a more agreeable form. I think going forward, it's important to remember that these ideas are Karp's beliefs at their best and most palatable. One reason to suspect that the authors were being intentionally dishonest in their description of progressive culture is that they often contradicted themselves. While on the one hand saying that young people in tech are too afraid to express any convictions, they also want to criticize tech companies for expressing worldviews they don't actually believe in. The result is that corporations selling consumer goods feel the need to develop and indeed broadcast their views on issues affecting our moral or interior lives, while most software companies with the capacity and perhaps duty to shape our geopolitics remain conspicuously silent. The Silicon Valley establishment has grown so suspicious and fearful of an entire category of thought, including contemplations on culture or national identity, that anything approaching a worldview is seen as a liability. The shallow and thinly veiled nihilism of corporate slogans such as "Don't be evil," which Google adopted when the company went public in 2004, and later exchanged for the similarly banal "Do the right thing," captures the view of a generation of extraordinarily talented software engineers who were taught to prize identification of and resistance to evil over the more difficult and often messy task of navigating the world in all its imperfections. Even within that last quote, you can see the two positions competing with one another. Clearly, if companies have these progressive mottos, they are not afraid to express beliefs about the world. Google's slogans, while shallow, put forth the view that companies are more than just machines to produce profit, but that they have an actual social responsibility. This alone shows that companies are willing to put forward views of how the world ought to be. The second critique, that companies don't live up to their mottos or don't really believe in them, is a separate issue. I think the authors do correctly identify a phenomenon here. The selective support companies show for social movements based on their popularity reveals the cynical and shallow nature of their public positions. The book is right to call out companies for failing to live up to purported beliefs. However, this is exactly what the employees at Google were doing when they protested Project Maven, something Karp repeatedly condemns. Companies like Google, which engage in this type of performative progressivism, are part of a larger trend which Slavoj Žižek calls cultural capitalism. While admitting that in the past and in the present, the free market system has often been overexploitative with catastrophic consequences, the claim is now made that one can discern the signs of a new orientation, which is aware that capitalist mobilization of a society's productive capacity can also be made to serve ecological goals, the struggle against poverty, and other worthy ends. Their preferred mottos have become social responsibility and gratitude. The new ethos of global responsibility is thus able to put capitalism to work as the most efficient instrument of the common good. The basic ideological dispositif of capitalism is separated from its concrete socioeconomic conditions and conceived of as an autonomous life or existential attitude which should and can be overcome by a new, more spiritual outlook, leaving these very capitalist relations intact. Instead of simply selling a product, companies have realized the power of selling ideas or movements to their customers. These often come as ways for the company to differentiate themselves from competitors, showing their own moral standing in the heartless world of the market. This isn't necessarily a bad thing either. To maintain this friendly image, many companies do legitimately good things. However, this is inherently a cynical play. The goal of expressing these beliefs is not to change the world, but to tap into a market of people who desire that change. Companies will only express these beliefs while it remains profitable for them to do so. Even if a company's founder is entirely altruistic in their endeavor, the market will punish them for sticking to these beliefs if it requires abandoning potential profit. This often creates tension between the profit-driven executives and the idealistic consumers and employees. The protests at Google are, again, a perfect example of this dynamic. The executives of the company saw the lucrative military contract as an opportunity, while the employees were more concerned about its ethical ramifications. Google changed its tune when the outrage threatened the company's marketability to progressive consumers, not because they realized the immorality of the contract. After the controversy died down and progressive groups lost their sway in the valley, Google returned to military contracting, reinforcing the idea that this decision was a pragmatic one. In Karp and Zamiska's analysis, the division between these two groups disappears. To avoid addressing the systemic market incentives which inevitably push companies to adopt performative ideologies, the authors place the blame entirely on progressive culture, despite the fact that progressives are often at odds with these same corporations. Without this distinction, the authors are forced to conclude that progressive culture is both scaring companies away from taking any stands, while also pushing them to make performative public statements. To better understand why these companies adopt these slogans and mottos, it's worth looking back at the history of this kind of cultural capitalism. In The New Spirit of Capitalism, Luc Boltanski and Yves Chiapello trace this trend back to the late 1960s, when capital realized it had to evolve to meet the demands of the era. It was by opposing a social capitalism planned and supervised by the state, and leaning on the artistic critique, autonomy, and creativity, that the new spirit of capitalism gradually took shape at the end of the crisis of the 1960s and 1970s. By adapting these sets of demands to the description of a new, liberated, even libertarian way of making profit, which was also said to allow for realization of the self in its most personal aspirations, the new spirit could be conceived in the initial stages of its formulation as transcending capitalism, thereby transcending anti-capitalism as well. During this period, consumers and employees wanted more freedom in the workplace and in the products they could consume. People were tired of being restrained by capitalism and wanted an outlet for self-expression and fulfillment. In response, companies adapted and began marketing themselves as purveyors of this individuality. This diffused the anti-capitalist sentiment that could threaten the system and reintegrated it into the market. The ideology perpetuated capitalism during this period was that engaging with the market allowed for the self-actualization that was the best way to support larger societal goods. Mark Fisher in Post-Capitalist Desire uses the famous Apple commercial as an example of this type of marketing. The commercial personifies Apple as a woman fighting against the dystopian big brother of IBM. The network-based individual focus of the iMac was the solution to the authoritarian large computer systems of the past. Rather than providing a purely utilitarian value, Apple products meant something more spiritual to the buyer, a rejection of the dull monotony produced by both the socialist USSR and the old capitalist regime. This period is actually where Karp and Zamiska think the country went astray. They use this same Apple commercial as an example of Silicon Valley's obsession with consumer goods, further promoting the atomization of our society. Ironically, the Palantir CEO takes the side of Big Brother in this commercial, rejecting this type of capitalism that is driven by the desire for individual freedom and expression. Despite the author's criticism of capitalism's expansion into the realm of personal identity, their solutions only continue this cycle. Similar to these past developments, the book's narrative takes criticisms of capitalism and reintegrates them into the market, solving them with yet another product. This can be seen with their seemingly harsh criticisms of the market system. Why must we always defer to the wisdom of the crowd when it comes to allocating scarce capital in a market economy? We seem to have unintentionally deprived ourselves of the opportunity to engage in a critical discussion about the business and endeavors that ought to exist, not merely the ventures that could. A commitment to capitalism and the rights of the individual, however ardent, will never be sufficient. It is too thin and meager, too narrow to sustain the human soul and psyche. Even in these quotes, which sound like a clear condemnation of the market, there is an emphasis on the failure to engage with the market correctly, rather than on the system itself. Karp and Zamiska fall into the trap, where they only address the alleged cultural ambivalence towards directing capital, and not capital's inherent desire to pursue profit above everything else. As Zizek noted, this approach places the blame on the ways consumers interact with the market rather than the market itself. The problem with capitalism becomes spiritual rather than systemic, and thus so do the solutions. Much like in the 60s, and with the more recent rise of movement-driven capitalism, complaints about the market are integrated back into it, muting any destabilizing threats. Palantir is not a rejection of this type of capitalism, but rather its evolution. The company turns the rejection of empty slogans, or the commodification of ideologies, into a commodity itself. To show that you don't like companies using social movements for profit, you can now buy Palantir stock. This safe form of market protest has done wonders for the company's stock price. As Mark Fisher writes, nothing runs better on MTV than a protest against MTV. The one way that Karp and Zamiska try to differentiate themselves from the other companies which capitalize off social trends is by arguing that their beliefs are authentic, while everyone else's are performative. This is an example of the market's infinite search for authenticity, as described in the New Spirit of Capitalism introduced earlier. The supply of authentic goods and human relations in the form of commodities was the only possible way of responding to the demand for authenticity that was compatible with the imperatives of accumulation. The commodification of authentic goods and services, in fact, possesses a paradoxical character. To earn the label authentic, these goods must be drawn from outside the commodity sphere. Consequently, it acknowledges, at least implicitly, that non-commodity goods are superior in value to commodity goods. For a commodity to be authentic, it must possess qualities from outside of the market. This dynamic is exemplified by vacations or tours that are marketed as authentic because they have yet to be tarnished by tourists. Ironically, it is the very process of turning these items or experiences into products which threatens their authenticity. Something is no longer authentic when it is tailored for the market, a process that must occur for it to be purchased at all. This is the same dynamic with Palantir.
Our nation is more important to us than anything. I'm not actually running the business thinking about how every little decision can help Palantir. I'm not. And we're not, that's not how this business is run. It never ran this way.
While Karp advertises the company as authentically caring about its values, it's still a business with shareholders and clients. If a belief threatened the success of the business in the long term, it would not adopt it. While Karp makes a lot of hay about the employees it lost after advertising it stood with Israel after October 7th, he doesn't talk about the IDF contracts they picked up because of their positive relationship with the government. While he often complains about the protests over his work with the US military, he doesn't mention how his unwavering support for the US government likely won the company further contracts. Because Palantir's survival depends on market support, its public positions are no more authentic than any progressive company which faces the same external pressures.
If you couldn't make money building Palantir or other defense tech startups, the idea would be an idea they study in some faculty by people who can't get a job. Well, how do I explain to my investors, in purely Milton Friedman-like terms, you're not supposed to do something that can in any way cost you a customer, ever. But by the way, I think one of the things that costs you a lot of customers is never doing anything that will cost you a customer. But
occasionally, in his interviews, Karp lets his mask slip and abandons the universalist language used in the book.
What I think is important is the primacy of the US government in deciding who does what. And what I care about, whether it's genuine or not, is that every single tech company in this country should be ashamed to not supply their tech to US soldiers. That's what I care about. And for some people, that's just not genuine. And for many, it is. I think, but what matters is what happens.
Here he admits that all he really cares about is that companies agree with him, not that they authentically commit to their own beliefs. This completely contradicts the liberal principles the book professes and shows, once again, that the text is meant to defend Palantir in a sanitized and palatable manner, not present an honest philosophical position. Another example of this tension is with Karp's public statement about the importance of military strength, AI development, and the potential threat of anti-war progressives.
The peace activists are actually the pro-war activists, and we're the peace activists. So you don't want war, you better be strong.
But there are really two ways America can be strong vis-a-vis our adversaries. One is put the fear of like death into our adversaries at any random moment, which I think, is happening for the first time in a long time.
And, maybe it's like in the absence of our adversaries, I think a lot of the things that we provide maybe shouldn't be built. But it's like they will build them or we will build them. Americans are the most loving, God-fearing, fair, least discriminatory people on the planet. And they want to know that if you're waking up and thinking about harming American citizens, or if American citizens are taken hostage and kept in dungeons, or if you're a foreign power sending fentanyl to poison our people, something really bad is going to happen to you and your friends and your cousins and your bank account and your mistress and whoever was involved.
How is someone meant to take these positions seriously when Karp, as the CEO of a military contractor, is incentivized to exaggerate the importance of a strong US military, regardless of what Karp authentically believes? These public statements are always going to be tailored to help the company he runs and is representing. This is not the fault of progressives who are scared to say what they believe, but the market, which pushes CEOs to express beliefs that will help their company. The author's refusal to engage with anything other than cultural trends continues with their discussion of previous eras of Silicon Valley. When describing the tech scene in the 40s, when companies worked closely with the US government, the emphasis is not on the federal programs that fostered this collaboration, but the cultural unity at the time. It was a culture, one that cohered around a shared objective, that won the last World War, and it will be a culture that wins, or prevents, the next one. What is omitted from this retelling is the massive government efforts that fostered this collaboration, not to discredit the unifying power of a global conflict, but to ignore the government's role in directing this innovation towards military efforts is misleading at best. Going into this book, I expected the author's solution to the unfixed problems in our society to be further government contracts and incentives. This seems so obvious because Palantir relies so heavily on government contracts and only survived because of the CIA's initial investment. While Palantir's anti-woke ideology may have helped them weather the storm of progressive protests, it was only because there was money in government contracts that they were able to keep the lights on. Especially since the authors often romanticize the wartime economy, government intervention seems like the obvious solution they would propose to solve America's problems. I think the obviousness of this point actually tricks some reviewers into believing that is what the authors are proposing. The New Yorker's otherwise well-argued review even suggests that the book is a rejection of Elon Musk's free market ideology in favor of more government intervention. It presents the technological republic as a diverging philosophy for tech bros who see the importance of state controls on the market. However, this is how the book itself actually describes Musk's work. There are exceptions to the technology industry's broad retreat of ambition. Elon Musk, for example, has founded 2 companies, Tesla and SpaceX, among others, that have stepped forward to fill glaring innovation gaps where national governments have stepped back. Tesla and SpaceX are the 2 shining examples, besides Palantir of course, that the book provides for companies who are doing it right. They're meant to show that the market can solve society's problems as long as CEOs are willing to take risks and tackle ambitious projects. This section is one of the most bizarre in the entire book, because both Tesla and SpaceX are companies entirely dependent on government subsidies, contracts, and grants. These should serve as examples of how the federal government can be used to solve problems that the market can't on its own. However, the book presents these as if they are instances of the market working on its own, without government support. Also, side note, Elon Musk is not the founder of Tesla. Like, famously, he was sued by its founder in 2009 because he kept referring to himself as one, even though he joined the company a year after it was started. Outside of Tesla, Musk is famous for this obsession with the founder title. Part of his exit contract with PayPal specifically stated that he could call himself a co-founder, even though he had not been with the company from the beginning. Given Karp's longtime connection to Musk and the Valley in general, I think he must know that Elon is not the founder of Tesla, and is only saying this to stay in his good graces, which is not a great indicator of the truthfulness of the rest of the text.
And then you have the issue, of course, of like who's running these companies and do you trust them? Because a lot of these technologies are quite dangerous, even what we're doing, and like if the person has a history of being completely untrustworthy, maybe that's a problem.
Regardless, the author's refusal to grapple with non-cultural issues means they ignore the material reasons why public opinion has shifted against subjects like the US military and protecting the West. As Gideon Lewis Krauss writes in The New Yorker, the military-industrial complex did not lose its luster because Americans were taught that all cultures are equally valid, or because sincerity as such went out of style. The military-industrial complex lost its luster when it embarked on a series of pointless and destructive wars. Our institutions were damaged by things that we did that cannot be repaired with an appeal to remember who we are. Despite the book's focus on how our culture has abandoned our institutions, it ignores how past failings may be at the root of this ambivalence, without understanding why people distrust the military, or nationalist ideologies, or Silicon Valley overseeing our civil liberties. The authors can never reach a conclusion that goes beyond just trying to rally the imagined silent majority and squashing their critics. In his public speeches, Karp frequently implores other business leaders to speak out and stop the spread of progressivism, assuming everyone who isn't speaking up must already agree with him.
Why do we say in public what everyone else believes in private? I.e., we should defend the West, we should not apologize for fighting terrorism, and we are going to provide our sharp tools to our allies.
The main reason I went is because we corporate leaders, especially corporate leaders who are running publicly traded companies, need to stop just parroting things we don't believe when it's popular, and then being silent when it's a little more controversial.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we have we had a movement, I think it's fading away, largely understood as wokeism, where people said, quite frankly, in public, lots of things that no one believed they believed in private.
Karp frequently brings up in interviews, and even in the book itself, that institutions lose support based on how well they perform, rather than how well they advertise themselves.
I went around and talked to older Germans. Okay, well, what were you thinking? What happened? Of course, in Frankfurt, all the old Germans were like, oh, none of us actually were involved in that. It was a complete lie. So it was like enlightened, so of course, nobody was pro-Nazi, right? So, but then I know a family in a small village that were super nice to me and like took care of me and gave me a coat. Like, really decent, wonderful, old school family. And I talked to the father, and I asked him, and he was like, look, we were all Nazis. And the only person who wasn't was my dad, and I could not figure out why he wasn't until years later. And then I talked to him about why did you become, and these people were became Democrats and built the German society. They were, my estimation is they were in no way, National Socialists anymore. And what became very, very clear in the conversations was they moved to become Democrats or, Republicans or pro-democracy because what they saw was, judge democracy by the fruits it bears. And we make the mistake at our peril in the West to forget, if we do not deliver fruits to our people in the form of a better, fairer, healthier society, we will lose people.
Problems that institutions have is they're like, well, this is a marketing problem. No, it's an underlying fundamentals problem. Your marketing can be pretty damn bad if your fundamentals are great. Witness Palantir's rise.
The risk is that we abandon a moral or ethical system oriented around results, the outcomes that matter most to people, less hunger, crime, and disease, in favor of a far more performative discourse where the management of messages around such outcomes eclipses the importance of the outcomes themselves. The book uses this framing to blame the modern distrust of institutions on the progressives who have allegedly taken them over. They argue that the obsession with performing moral righteousness has gotten in the way of producing results for citizens, leading to distrust from the public. However, the authors failed to use this same lens to examine why progressives themselves are distrustful of certain institutions. Instead, they argue that the public just needs to remember their collective identity and the criticisms will wash away, allowing companies like Palantir to continue free from opposition. Before this section ends, I want to mention a couple more examples of how the philosophy of the book is motivated by the need to defend Palantir. There are portions of this text which, when taken out of context, appear totally reasonable. However, when you realize what the book is responding to and how this connects to Palantir's project, their purpose becomes much more sinister. For example, the authors argue that our progressive culture is becoming too harsh on our public figures. We have become too focused on the personal lives of politicians, pushing away potentially effective leaders who aren't interested in the spotlight. The unrelenting scrutiny to which contemporary public figures are now subjected has also had the counterproductive effect of dramatically reducing the ranks of individuals interested in venturing into politics and adjacent domains. We think we want and need to know our leaders, but what about results? The likability of our elected leaders is essentially a modern preoccupation and has become a national obsession. Yet at what cost? On its own, I think this point is fine. I might argue that the current leaders of our society are so uniquely unlikable that this may not be having the type of effect the authors see.
You drink coffee, man, or no?
Nah.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, you've had it.
I have. Sometimes on vacation I'll drink it recreationally. It's like every once in a while.
Just like it's like a celebration.
Yeah, no. It's
really?
Yeah, no.
However, there is a moment where it becomes clear what the authors really mean when they say our culture is too obsessed with scrutinizing our leaders. We have, as a culture, decided to shift our focus to the enforcement of the administrative rules and regulations that many tell themselves are our best and perhaps only defense against a slow decline into corruption. Yet we refuse to engage with what is lost and traded away. The speed with which we increasingly have abandoned the unpopular, the unlikable, and the less than charismatic personalities among us should give us pause. The risk is that we begin to privilege the seemingly unobjectionable goals of transparency and process over what actually matters, building submarines, developing our most elusive cures, preventing terrorist attacks, and advancing our interests. While it is couched in a cultural critique, this is an overt attempt to open up more avenues for profit by reducing regulation. They couch it in this inoffensive language of acceptance, when really, they just want to move fast and break things. For the CEO of a surveillance company, this is very alarming rhetoric. If anything, I would argue that Palantir needs more transparency, even if that means less efficiency. At no point in the history of Palantir have I come across a time where they were too regulated or too scrutinized. Additionally, the authors use an extremely odd example to prove this point. As an instance of the ravenous pragmatism of the past, the culture that cared about results more than virtue signaling, they reference the US government hiring former Nazi scientists after the war. This is meant to be admirable because it showed a commitment to results with less concern for public appearance. However, this contradicts the book's whole message that we need a unifying identity and mission. If the US was unified around beating the Nazis during the war, hiring them right after doesn't seem like a great way to promote patriotism. In another instance, here is how the authors talk about the prevalence of masks at the recent pro-Palestinian protests on college campuses. The protective veil of anonymity may instead be robbing this generation of an opportunity to develop an instinct for real ownership over an idea, of the reward for victory in the public square, as well as the cost of defeat. Out of context, there may be an interesting point here. People who take a public stand should care about the issue enough to accept responsibility for their statements. In the same way that ICE agents and IDF officials shouldn't cover their face to avoid accountability, it is not unreasonable to expect protesters to be comfortable being connected to their own beliefs in a society that protects open debate. However, this is ignoring the harsh punishments protesters can face for expressing these beliefs. This is something the authors should recognize, as they spend most of the book focused on the problems with cancel culture. Using masks seems like something the authors would love, as it allows for public discourse about controversial ideas, despite the potential for harsh backlash. If protesting can lead to someone being deported, anyone who cares about free speech should be more concerned with this crackdown on expression than the use of masks. That is, unless you run a company that helps police departments identify people using facial recognition. In another section, which is my favorite of the book, it becomes clear why the authors spend so much time focusing on cancel culture. The dystopian future that Orwell and others have imagined may be near, but not because of the surveillance state or contraptions built by Silicon Valley giants that rob us of our privacy or most intimate moments alone. It is we, not our technical creations, who are to blame for failing to encourage and enable the radical acts of belief in something above and beyond, and external to the self. The speed and enthusiasm which the culture skewers anyone for the perceived transgressions and errors only further diminishes our capacity to move towards truth. I think it's amazing how the head of a surveillance company is attempting to place the blame on everyone else for the threat of digital surveillance. People fear a surveillance state not because of rising cancel culture, but because companies like Palantir make it increasingly impossible to maintain any semblance of privacy. Communities throughout history have been harsh to individuals who break their ethical codes, but it is only through modern technology that this threat becomes a dystopian nightmare, as imagined in 1984.
Everybody has to try to sell something. If you don't have something to sell, you sell words right now. So you're selling something that doesn't work, can't work. You're explaining to your enterprise.
The part I love is that we're winning. The part I love almost more is that we're getting to do our usual humiliate the critics of Palantir, and it makes my life a lot of fun.
I guess it's an unpopular view that occasionally you have to begin discussions in private, but it is my view. And I'm sure at some point these discussions will be open and no legislation will happen. But in the end, we all have to come in there and say, this is what I really believe.
It's like, I'm sympathetic with non-discrimination. I don't believe in discrimination across any variable.
After reading Karp's book, watching dozens of hours of his interviews, and tracking down clips from an obscure German documentary about him, I think I can finally say I do not like him. Despite the ideological front to his company's practices, I think it is clear that he either doesn't believe what he says or doesn't live up to his own ideals. Karp's co-founder Thiel gets much more coverage for being the stereotypical movie villain.
You would prefer the human race to endure, right? You're hesitating.
Yeah, well,
Yes?
I don't know. I would.
This is a long hesitation. This is a long hesitation.
There's so many questions implicit in this.
But I think Karp's public appearances are honestly more unsettling.
That's a separate issue. How do you get that advantage into our the most important part of our economy, which is defense, or I would like to call offense, against our adversaries? I don't know why we have to wait to be attacked, but we don't do that at Palantir.
Okay.
We don't wait to be attacked. But
the flippant and glib manner in which he brags about killing people is deeply disturbing. I don't know if he is the same pharmacologist as Elon Musk, but his erratic behavior during more recent interviews suggests these antics are not going away.
That focus on civil liberties is making us really rich, which drives the woke, pagan, religious practicing, Neanderthal thinking people who ignore technology absolutely nuts on the right and the left while we're building AI. By the way, I asked for permission before I went nuts.
Unfortunately, it is these same sociopathic public statements, as well as Palantir's stock price, that has gained him his fan base. I think the Technological Republic was an attempt to turn the cult around Palantir into a real movement, similar to Musk's recent venture into politics. Like many powerful CEOs, Karp's business success has convinced him he must be equally talented at any other endeavor he tries his hand at. Given his book's mixed reception, I think it's fair to say so far this has proven false. One of the main problems with the technological republic, even to a reader who generally agrees with its message, is that it feels extremely dated. The landscape it paints of a Silicon Valley which is afraid to work with the government is no longer accurate. The author's dream of a patriotic tech scene has already come true, leaving the text with little to offer for the future. There's a lot of fear-mongering about Palantir, about its plans to create a techno-nationalist surveillance state a la Big Brother, but I think a lot of this concern is unfounded. Despite his outrageous media appearances, Karp is not the kind of visionary needed for world domination. While Thiel has clear plans for expanding his empire into every facet of American government, Karp is not that type of leader. Much like Palantir itself, Karp is a tool of the rich and powerful who pay for his services. He is willing to say what he needs to get to the top, even if at times this requires being unpopular, and he says it enough that I think he started to believe it himself. His philosophy is just as reactionary as the company's strategy. It is rooted entirely in a rejection of the present moment, and is unable to imagine a better future. If the US descends into a fully authoritarian fascist state, that government will most likely use Palantir's software. However, the one in charge of this state will almost certainly not be Alex Karp. Thank God.